Nobody saw this coming. The big courthouse in New York City got super quiet when Janice Combs, Sean Diddy Combs' 83-year-old mom, walked up to the witness stand. Diddy, who had been acting calm during the whole trial, suddenly got really stiff. His lawyers looked at each other with scared faces. The prosecution team sat up really straight. This was the moment that would change everything. If you're new to our channel, please take a moment to like and subscribe for the best coverage of big court cases like this one. We give you real deep reporting you won't find anywhere else. Nobody thought Diddy's own mom would testify. The room was already full of stress during what had been a really tense day. People's eyes were glued to the old woman as she slowly walked to the front of the courtroom. When she was sworn in, people gasped loudly through the room. Even the judge looked shocked. No warning, no heads up, just Janice Combs, the woman who had supported her son through decades of success and drama, now ready to speak under oath. Until that moment, Diddy had looked confident throughout the trial, often talking with his legal team and sometimes smiling at supporters in the crowd. But something had changed. Maybe it was seeing his mom, his biggest supporter, taking the stand as a witness against him. Maybe it was realizing that the person who knew him better than anyone was about to speak freely. Maybe it was understanding that his carefully built defense was about to fall apart. Whatever it was, Diddy was done pretending. He wasn't sitting there as a celebrity anymore. He was there as a son, watching his mom get ready to tell the truth about him. And when Janice Combs started to speak, the courtroom wasn't ready for what they would hear, because what his mom revealed about their private talks, her growing about their private talks, worries over the years, and the truth she could no longer hide, wasn't just terrible for his case. It was a mother's painful acceptance of who her son had really become. It started like any other day of the trial. The room buzzed with quiet talks. The reporters hunched in their special rows, and lawyers whispered plans as they waited for the day's court stuff to begin. But when the prosecutor said the United States calls Janice Combs, the room changed. You could hear a pin drop. Some people thought it was a mistake. Others thought it was a desperate move. But the way Janice Combs walked to the stand, her eyes there, back straight despite being old, her eyes clear and determined, told everyone this was real. The judge raised an eyebrow, and Diddy, who'd been looking at papers with his lawyers, suddenly looked like he'd been hit. The color went away from his face. His hands, which had been confidently flipping through papers, stopped moving. Janice Combs took her seat at the witness stand without looking at anyone. She didn't even look at her son, who was now staring at her with a look of shock and feeling betrayed. Mrs. Combs, thank you for being here today. The prosecutor started. I understand how hard this must be, Brian. Janice Combs nodded slightly, her calmness amazing under the situation. The judge allowed it, and from that moment on, the whole trial changed, because what Janice Combs was about to say wasn't part of any media story. It wasn't guessing testimony from old employees or business friends. It was the story of the woman who had raised him, who had celebrated his wins and defended him against critics for decades. Diddy's lawyer immediately said no arguing that family talks were private and that Mrs. Combs' testimony would be unfair. The prosecutor said back that no legal rule protected talks between a mother and grown son, especially when those talks were about possible criminal stuff. After a quick sidebar, the judge said no to the objection and told Mrs. Combs to continue. The courtroom was totally silent. Reporters had stopped typing, their fingers hanging over keyboards. Even the court sketch artists had stopped, pencils floating above paper. Diddy's family members in the crowd looked shocked and confused, while the prosecution team kept carefully blank faces. Janice Combs fixed her glasses and looked right at the prosecutor. I've been asked to testify about talks I've had with my son over the years, and about things I've seen that worried me. I'm here because I believe the truth needs to be told, no matter how much it hurts. A whisper went through the courtroom. Diddy's main lawyer stood up to object again, but Diddy himself pulled at his sleeve, pulling him back down. It was like he already knew what was coming and had given up on fighting it. The prosecutor came closer to Ray with a gentle way, clearly thinking of the witness's age and how emotionally hard this was for her. Mrs. Combs, could you please tell the court about your relationship with your son? Janice Combs took a deep breath and started to speak, her voice steady despite how hard this was. The words that came next would forever change the direction of one of the most talked about criminal trials in recent memory. I raised Sean as a single mother after his father was killed when he was just a child, Janice Combs started. I worked many jobs to provide for him to give him chances. I never had. I wanted him to be strong, to be successful, to make something of himself, and he did that. He went beyond every dream I had for him. She talked about the pride she felt watching her son rise from intern to music boss, from producer to performer, from businessman to billionaire. Her face got softer as she remembered his days of ambition and determination. Sean was always charming, always a leader. Even as a boy, he could convince anyone of anything. He had that gift. She said, a small smile briefly crossing her face before going away. But somewhere along the way, something changed. She turned slightly toward the jury. Success came so fast, so completely, suddenly. Everyone was saying yes to him. Everyone wanted something from him. Everyone treated him like he was above the rules that regular people had to follow. And I started to see him believe it. The prosecutor gently guided her through her memories of the early 2000s when Diddy's career was at its peak. Janice Combs described how she started noticing troubling patterns in her son's behavior, his growing control over people around him, his explosive anger when challenged, his casual disregard for boundaries. At first, I told myself it was the pressure. Explained the entertainment industry can be brutal, and he was handling so much. But then I started hearing things, seeing things when I visited his homes, young women who seemed confused, staff who appeared afraid of him, rooms I wasn't allowed to go into. She told about a particular visit to his Miami heroes, saying, "House in 2008, I arrived without calling ahead. Mothers can do that," she said, earning a few nervous laughs from the crowd. There had been a party the night before. When I walked in, there were staff cleaning up, but they seemed different. Not the normal after-party cleanup. They were collecting phones. Different rooms. One young woman was crying while a security guard walked her out. When Sean saw me, he was mad that I hadn't called ahead. The prosecutor showed Mrs. Combs a photograph. "Do you recognize this place?" She looked at it and nodded. "This is the pool house at Sean's Los Angeles home." He changed it into what he called a studio around 2010, but he was very secretive about it. I wasn't allowed inside, which seemed weird to me. I had always been welcome everywhere in his homes before that. She described how her worries grew over the years, how she tried to talk about them with her son. I asked questions. Mothers do that too, she said, her voice stronger now, but he would dismiss me, tell me I didn't understand how things worked in his world, that everything was agreed to, that it was just the lifestyle of the music industry. The prosecutor asked about specific talks. Did your son ever discuss with you accusations made against him by women? Janice Combs nodded. Slowly, yes. When the first accusations started coming out publicly around 2017, I called him right away. Any mother would. I asked him directly if there was any truth to them. He told me they were lying, that they wanted money, that this happened to all successful men in the industry. She stopped, visibly gathering her strength. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. He was my son, and did something happen to change that belief? The prosecutor asked gently. Yes, she replied, her voice getting quieter. In late 2023, after Cassie filed her lawsuit, I confronted him again. We were alone in his apartment in New York. I told him I needed to hear the truth, not what his lawyers were telling him to say, not what he was telling the public, just the truth between a mother and son. The courtroom was absolutely still as she continued. He was different that day. Tired, maybe the fake act cracked a little. He didn't admit everything, but he said something I'll never forget. Mom, you don't build what I've built by playing by everyone else's rules. Sometimes people get hurt. That's business. Her voice broke slightly for the first time. That's not how I raised him. That's not business. That's not right. Throughout this testimony, Diddy sat still, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. His lawyers wrote notes frantically, sometimes leaning in to whisper to each other. But Diddy himself seemed beyond their reach, lost in hearing his mother's words. Janice Combs continued, describing how her worries got worse in early 2024. The security video of Diddy attacking Cassie in a hotel hallway was released. I called him right away. After seeing that video, I was devastated. Doesn't begin to describe it. I asked him how he could do such a thing. He told me it was a difficult time in their relationship, that I was only seeing one moment without context, that he wasn't that person anymore. Did you believe him? The prosecutor asked. No, she replied simply, not anymore, because I had seen glimpses of that rage myself over the years, never directed at me. But at staff, at business friends, the Sean in that video wasn't a stranger, and that realization broke my heart as her testimony continued. She described her growing awareness that the accusations against her son formed a pattern too consistent to dismiss. She told about finding disturbing notes in his home office during a visit in early 2024 list of women's names with notes, like handled and potential problem next to them. When I asked him about it, he took the paper from my hands and told me it was business. Nothing for me to worry about, she said. But the look in his eyes, I knew as a mother. You know when your child is hiding something even when they're grown. The prosecutor came closer with another exhibit. Mrs. Combs, I'm showing you what has been marked as Government Exhibit 42. Do you recognize this document? She looked at the paper and nodded slowly. Yes, these are notes I started keeping after that talk. I started writing down things I had seen over the years. Talks we had behaviors that worried me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. And why did you begin keeping these notes? Because I was afraid I was losing perspective, that my love for my son was clouding my judgment. Writing it all down helped me see the pattern more clearly, and what I saw scared me. At this point, Dee finally looked up, meeting his mother's eyes for the first time since she had taken the stand. The moment was brief but electric, a silent communication between mother and son that seemed to contain volumes of unspoken pain, betrayal, and maybe understanding. Janice Combs turned back to the prosecutor, her resolve visibly strengthened. I love my son, that will never change, but I cannot pretend anymore. I cannot be quiet anymore. Too many people have been hurt. The prosecutor came closer with careful consideration of the witness's emotional state. Mrs. Combs, I want to ask you about a specific talk you had with your son in April of this year after his arrest, but before this trial started. Can you tell the court about that talk? Janice Combs straightened in her seat as if getting ready for the hardest part of her testimony. Yes, I visited Sean at the jail. It was just the two of us in a private room. They made special arrangements because of who he is, she continued. I told him that I needed to hear the truth, all of it, before I could continue supporting him publicly. I said, Sean, I'm your mother. I love you no matter what, but I need to know what I'm standing behind. The courtroom was totally silent. As she told about his response, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said the truth. The truth is, I created a world where I made the rules, where what I wanted happened, where people either played along or got pushed aside. Was it always right? No. Did people get hurt? Yes, but that's how power works, Ma. That's how it's always worked. She stopped, taking a moment to calm herself. I asked him about the specific accusations, the parties, the recordings, the threats. I needed to hear him deny it if it wasn't true. And did he deny it? The prosecutor asked. No, she replied simply. He said, it's complicated. Everything was agreed to at the beginning. Nobody was forced, but once you're in that world, the lines get blurred. Sometimes people change their minds later, but by then they'd already taken the money, the opportunities. They'd already benefited. Janice Combs's hands shook slightly as she continued. I told him that consent gotten through pressure, through fear of consequences, through being drunk. That isn't real consent. He just looked at me and said, that's not how it works in my world. At the defense table, Diddy's lawyers looked increasingly alarmed. His main lawyer wrote a note and pushed it toward him, but Diddy ignored it, his eyes now fixed on his mother. The prosecutor gently pressed, did your son ever clearly admit to the criminal conduct he's charged with? Not in those words, Janice Combs replied, but he told me enough for me to understand the truth. He said the system I built worked for years. Everyone got what they wanted. Only became a problem when people decided to change the rules. She looked directly at the jury. I raised my son to take responsibility for his actions, to be accountable. When he told me that, I knew he had lost his way. He wasn't seeing people as people anymore, just as pieces in a game. He believed he controlled the control. The prosecutor introduced another exhibit, a letter written by Janice Combs to her son. After that visit, in it, she expressed her unconditional love, but also her deep disappointment and her unwillingness to continue defending behavior she now understood to be destructive and wrong. Did you receive a response to this letter? The prosecutor asked. Yes, she replied. Sean called me. He was angry at first, then almost begging, he said. I didn't understand what was at stake, that his whole life, everything he'd built, was on the line. I told him that was exactly why I had to speak the truth, because lives were at stake, just not only his. The prosecutor then asked about her decision to testify. Mrs. Combs, what brought you here today? Why did you agree to testify in this case? Janice Combs took a deep breath. Because the truth matters, because accountability matters, because I raised my son to be better than this, and because I believe that true love, a mother's love, means wanting your child to face the consequences of their actions so they can become better, not protecting them from those consequences and watching them become worse. She looked at her son again, longer this time. I'm here because I love my son. Enough to tell the truth about him, even when that truth is painful. I'm here because the women who were hurt deserve someone to stand up and acknowledge their pain. And I'm here because Sean needs to understand that no amount of money, fame, or power places you above basic human decency. As she spoke these words, something in Diddy's calmness finally broke. His shoulders sagged, his carefully kept expression of confidence crumbled. For the first time since the trial started, he looked not like a powerful music mogul, but like a son facing his mother's disappointment. Maybe the one judgment he had never prepared himself to face. The prosecutor thanked Mrs. Combs and went back to her seat. The defense lawyer stood for cross examination, but his approach was notably gentle, almost respectful. He didn't try to discredit her or suggest bad motives, focusing instead on establishing that she hadn't directly seen any criminal acts, and that her testimony was based on talks and impressions rather than first-hand observation. Alleged crimes. Throughout the cross-examination, Janice Combs stayed calm, acknowledging the limitations of her testimony while standing firmly by its central truth that her son had created and operated a system that exploited and harmed others, and that he had basically admitted this to her in private talks. As she was finally excused from the witness stand, she stopped, looking directly at her son once more. No words were exchanged, but the look contained decades of love, disappointment, and a mother's lasting hope for redemption. Then she walked slowly past the defense table and out of the courtroom. Her back straight, her dignity intact. Diddy watched her go, and something in his expression suggested that of all the testimony the jury had heard over the weeks of trial. His mother's words had affected him most deeply. The masks had fallen away, leaving only the truth between a mother and her son. Following Janice Combs' testimony, the prosecution called Dr. Margaret Chen, an expert in family psychology, specializing in cases involving powerful public figures. After establishing her credentials, the prosecutor asked her to explain the significance of what the court had just heard. What we witnessed today was extraordinary, Dr. Chen explained. In high-profile cases involving wealthy or famous defendants, we often see family members either staying silent or providing unwavering support, regardless of the evidence. For a mother to testify, as Mrs. Combs did, represents a profound break from that pattern. She continued, from a psychological perspective, this suggests that Mrs. Combs reached what we call a moral tipping point, a moment when the cognitive dissonance between loving her son and recognizing the harm he has caused became too great to sustain. The fact that she described a gradual awakening, rather than a sudden realization, lends significant credibility to her testimony. The prosecutor asked about the specific dynamics. Janice Combs had described the pattern of her son dismissing her concerns, invoking business as justification, and suggesting that normal rules didn't apply to him. These are classic manifestations of what we call power insulation, Dr. Chen explained. Individuals with extreme wealth, fame, and influence often become surrounded by people who reinforce their sense of exceptionalism and shield them from consequences. A mother is often the last person who can penetrate that as insulation, because she knew the individual before the power, before the wealth. She elaborated on how Diddy's reported statements to his mother revealed a worldview shaped by decades of having his behavior normalized, excused, or concealed by those around him. When Mr. Combs allegedly told his mother, "That's how power works," he was expressing a belief system that had likely been reinforced countless times throughout his career. The prosecutor displayed excerpts from Janice Combs' notes on the courtroom screens. Dr. Chen, what do you make of the evolution in Mrs. Combs' observations over time after SIDA. Reviewing the notes, which spanned from 2008 to 2024, Dr. Chen pointed out how the mother's initial benefit of the doubt interpretations gradually gave way to more concerned observations, culminating in explicit documentation of troubling patterns. What's notable here is the consistency of the behaviors Mrs. Combs recorded even as her interpretation of those behaviors evolved. Dr. Chen observed early entries show her attributing concerning incidents to stress industry pressure or isolated bad judgment later. Entries show her recognizing the same behaviors as part of a pattern of control and exploitation. As Dr. Chen continued her testimony, she placed Janice Combs' observations in the context of the broader allegations against Diddy, explaining how a mother's perspective offered unique insight into the authentic character of an individual who had spent decades crafting a carefully managed public image. In my professional experience, she stated, when family members who have loyally supported a defendant reach a point where they can no longer reconcile their love with the evidence before them, it often represents a critical turning point in both legal proceedings and the defendant's own self-perception. Throughout this expert testimony, Diddy remained withdrawn, occasionally whispering to his lawyers, but primarily staring at the table before him. The confident demeanor that had characterized his courthouse appearances had vanished, replaced by what observers described as a combination of resignation and profound distress. The defense's cross-examination of Dr. Freitreis. Chen focused on the generalities of her analysis rather than the specifics of Janice Combs' testimony, suggesting she was offering speculative interpretations without direct knowledge of the family dynamics. Dr. Chen acknowledged the limitations of her analysis, but maintained that the patterns described were consistent with well-established psychological principles regarding power, accountability, and family systems. As this portion of testimony concluded, the impact of Janice Combs' words continued to reverberate through the courtroom. Jurors who had previously appeared stoic or neutral during even the most disturbing testimony now showed visible emotional reactions, several wiping away tears, others taking extensive notes, all seemingly processing the weight of a mother's testimony against her own son. When court reconvened after a brief recess, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Sources close to the defense team reported that Diddy had been nearly unreachable during the break, refusing to engage with his attorney's attempts to discuss strategy. The prosecution team, meanwhile, appeared to be recalibrating their approach. In light of the morning's powerful testimony, Judge Aaron Subramanian addressed both legal teams in light of this morning's developments. Does either side wish to make any motions or requests before we continue? Diddy's lead attorney stood, Your Honor, the defense requests a brief continuance to confer with our client and reassess our position. The request was unusual at this stage of a trial that had already stretched for weeks. The prosecutor objected, arguing that a delay would disrupt the jury's focus and potentially prejudice the government's case. After consideration, the judge granted a limited continuance until the following morning, instructing the jury to return at 9 a.m. as court adjourned for the day. Reporters rushed to file stories with headlines like Mother's Testimony Shakes Diddy Trial and Janice Combs Breaks Silence against son. Legal analysts on every network debated the impact of the testimony, with most concluding that it represented a potentially insurmountable blow to the defense. When proceedings resumed the next morning, the courtroom was even more crowded, with spectators lining up before dawn, hoping for a seat. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation as the judge took the bench and the jury was seated before testimony could resume. Diddy's attorney stood, Your Honor, after extensive consultation with our client, we request the opportunity for Mr. Combs to address the court. The request sent murmurs through the gallery. The prosecutor objected immediately, arguing that any statement from the defendant should come through proper testimony under oath and subject to cross-examination. After hearing arguments from both sides, the judge made his ruling. Mr. Combs, if you wish to make a statement to this court, you must do so from the witness stand under oath and subject to cross-examination by the prosecution. Do you understand and agree to these conditions? All eyes turned to Diddy, who stood slowly. Yes, Your Honor, I understand and agree. Decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Until this moment, legal experts had widely assumed Diddy would not testify following the standard strategy in criminal cases where defendants risk creating additional vulnerability through their testimony. His decision to take the stand signaled either a dramatic shift in strategy or a personal choice that overrode his attorney's advice after being sworn in. Diddy took the witness stand. Gone was the designer suit and confident demeanor that had characterized his court appearances. Instead, he wore a simple, dark suit. His posture subdued, his expression somber. His attorney began with a simple question. "Mr. Combs, why have you chosen to testify today?" Diddy looked up, his eyes moving briefly across the crowded courtroom before settling on the jury. "I listened to my mother. Yesterday, really listened, and I realized I've been hiding from the truth for so long that I'd almost convinced myself of the lies." His voice was quieter than anyone had heard it before, lacking the charismatic force that had helped build his empire. "My mother raised me better than what I became. She taught me about respect, about integrity." About treating people right somewhere along the tree. Way I lost sight of those lessons. His attorney seemed momentarily thrown by this opening, but recovered. "Can you tell the jury about your understanding of the charges against you?" "I understand that I'm charged with serious crimes," Diddy replied. "Racketeering, sex, trafficking, coercion. For years, I told myself that what I was doing was just business, just the way the industry works. I told myself that everyone benefited, everyone consented. Everyone knew what they were getting into." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But that wasn't true. I created an environment where people couldn't freely say no, where the threat of consequences, career destruction, public humiliation, financial ruin hung over every interaction. I didn't call it coercion, I called it leverage. But it was wrong." As Diddy continued his testimony, he described how success, wealth, and power had gradually corrupted his perspective. He spoke about creating a world where his desires were paramount, where staff and associates understood that their job was to facilitate and then cover up whatever he wanted. He acknowledged creating a system of NDA payoffs and threats that kept victims silent for years. "I convinced myself that if people took the money, accepted the opportunities, signed the agreements, then everything was consensual. I ignored the power differential that made true consent impossible." In many of those situations, when asked about specific allegations from victims who had testified earlier in the trial, Diddy largely confirmed their accounts, occasionally adding that his memory of certain events was compromised by his own substance use at the time. His attorney, clearly navigating unfamiliar territory with a client who was not following the expected defense strategy, asked about Janice Combs' testimony. "Your mother described," enters attorney, "conversations where you essentially admitted to creating a system that exploited others. Was her recollection accurate?" Diddy nodded slowly. "Yes, my mother has never lied to me or about me. She told the truth yesterday when she visited me after my arrest. I did tell her those things. I was still justifying my behavior, then still telling myself that power simply operated by different rules. I couldn't see or didn't want to see how wrong that was." As direct examination concluded, the prosecutor approached for cross-examination. Her approach was direct but measured, recognizing that Diddy's apparent confession required careful handling. "Mr. Combs, you've described creating a system where consent was compromised by power differentials, threats, and coercion. Are you aware that what you're describing aligns with the legal definitions of the crimes you're charged with?" "Yes," Diddy replied. "I've had a lot of time to think since my arrest, a lot of time to learn about these laws and understand how they apply to my actions, and yet you initially plead not guilty to all charges. What changed?" Diddy looked toward the gallery where his mother had been sitting the day before, though her seat was now empty. "Yesterday happened. Hearing my mother speak the truth that I have been denying for so long, it has broke something open in me. The last offense I had was telling myself that the people who really knew me, who loved me, they understood I wasn't the monster the prosecution was describing." Hearing my mother's testimony took that away. The prosecutor's questioning became more specific, walking Diddy through the elements of each criminal charge and effectively extracting admissions that aligned with the legal definitions of sex trafficking, racketeering, and the other counts he faced. By the time cross-examination concluded, Diddy appeared exhausted and defeated his testimony rather than offering. Defense had effectively corroborated the prosecution's case in many respects as he stepped down from the witness stand. He paused, looking out at the courtroom filled with reporters, victims, curious spectators, and his own family members for a moment. It seemed he might make an additional statement, but instead he simply returned to the defense table in silence. The judge called for a brief recess before the next witness. As the courtroom began to clear, Diddy remained seated, staring straight ahead, the weight of his own testimony visibly pressing down on him. The man who had once built an empire, confidence and charisma, had just dismantled it with his own words. Following the recess, in a move that stunned the courtroom, Diddy's attorneys requested a meeting with the prosecution and the judge in chambers. When they emerged 30 minutes later, the judge addressed the court. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been informed that the defendant wishes to change his plea before we proceed. I want to ensure that this decision is being made knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily. The judge then conducted a thorough colloquy with Diddy, ensuring he understood the rights he was waiving and the potential sentences he faced. When asked if anyone had coerced him into changing his plea, Diddy shook his head. No, Your Honor, this is my decision after hearing my mother's testimony and reflecting on the truth of my actions. I cannot, in good conscience, continue to deny responsibility. The judge accepted the change of plea scheduling, sentencing for 6 weeks later. As the proceedings concluded, victims who had testified during the trial watched in silence, some holding hands, others wiping away tears. The case that many had expected to continue for weeks had reached an unexpected resolution in the wake of a mother's testimony and a son's belated acknowledgement of the truth. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed for reactions. Janice Combs, who had returned to witness her son's change of plea, made a brief statement. Today is a difficult day, but also a necessary one. I love my son unconditionally. That will never change, but love without truth isn't really love at all. I hope this is the beginning of healing for Sean, for those he harmed, and for our family. As Diddy was led from the courtroom in custody, his final public appearance before sentencing, he looked nothing like the music mogul who had a billion-dollar empire. He looked like what he had finally admitted to being, a man who had abused his power and was now facing the consequences. When Sean Diddy Combs changed his plea to guilty, he didn't look like someone who had lost a legal battle. He looked like someone who had finally found a kind of peace in the truth. The courtroom remained quiet, processing the unexpected turn of events. Even the judge seemed momentarily at a loss for words before recovering his professional demeanor to handle the technical aspects of accepting the plea. Some of the jurors, released from their duty without having to deliberate, had tears in their eyes, and Diddy, for the first time since his arrest, looked unburdened. Not of responsibility, but of the weight of denial he had carried for so long. Diddy didn't speak to the press following the proceedings. He was immediately taken into custody, where he would remain until sentencing. His legal team issued a brief statement. Mr. Combs has accepted responsibility for his deed, for his actions. He asks for privacy for his family during this difficult time and expresses deep remorse to those he has harmed. But outside the courtroom, the world was only beginning to react. The music industry, which had initially responded to Diddy's arrest with cautious statements about letting the legal process unfold, now faced the reality of his admission. Record labels issued statements condemning abuse of power and announcing reviews of internal policies. Artists who had collaborated with him distanced themselves, some expressing shock, others admitting they had heard rumors for years but hadn't known what to believe. Behind closed doors, entertainment companies convened emergency meetings. Contracts were reviewed, projects canceled, associations severed, and while many tried to frame Diddy's behavior as that of a lone bad actor, the internet was already connecting dots that suggested a more systemic problem. Old interviews resurfaced showing industry insiders alluding to how things work in language eerily similar to what Diddy had described in his testimony. Photos and videos from industry events were re-examined with new context, and most significantly, other victims from across the entertainment world began coming forward with their own stories of abuse and exploitation. Fans weren't just shocked, they were engaged in painful self-examination. Many expressed guilt for having supported Diddy's career despite years of rumors and allegations. Others questioned why it had taken a fear and Mother's testimony to finally break through the wall of protection that wealth and fame had built. The era of unquestioning celebrity worship showed signs of cracking at the sentencing hearing 6 weeks later. Janice Combs was present, seated in the front row. She watched as several victims delivered powerful impact statements describing how Diddy's actions had damaged their careers, their trust, and their sense of self-worth. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, Diddy addressed the court. "I want to apologize to everyone I've hurt through my actions, to the women who trusted me and whose trust I betrayed, to the colleagues and employees I implicated in my behavior, to my children who now have to live with the legacy of their father's mistakes, and to my mother who taught me better than how I chose to live." He continued, his voice steady but humbled. "I can't undo the harm I've caused. I can only acknowledge it."